Trust in politics is broken. So can we get UK politics working again?
That was the last time we were happy. 2012.
I'm Beth Rigby, Sky's political editor. Join me every week with Labour's Jess Phillips and Conservative peer Ruth Davidson for some electoral dysfunction.
This idea of nuance has completely left politics.
Yeah. Together, we'll focus on the policies that could deliver political satisfaction. Follow Electoral Dysfunction wherever you get your podcasts.
Now, you don't need to be Nigel Farage to realise that immigration is one of the battlegrounds this election. Small boats have somehow become a big thing. There is undeniably concern about the pressure that year after year of historically high migration is having on the provision of public services and housing. And that's certainly something borne out by the polls. A YouGov survey carried out exclusively for Sky News shows that more people, 43% in fact, believe that immigration has had a negative impact on society compared to the 35% who believe it a positive influence. And although the results varied according to location, it was only in London and Scotland that people were more likely to say immigration was a force for good. Clearly, we need to talk about migration, even if we don't like to. I'm Niall Paterson. Welcome to the Sky News Daily. Our economics and data editor, Ed Conway, has been playing with his calculator. Both of them will be here just a little later. But mass migration is an issue in many communities, so we begin with our communities correspondent, Becky Johnson. Becky, tell us about your trip to Swindon, because look, Swindon itself is a pretty interesting place of where it is, what it is, and it's always been pretty attractive to people migrating to this country.
So Swindon's a railway town,
Yeah.
Built around the station. In the Victorian times, workers from around Britain went to work there because of the trains. And now, in much more recent times, we've seen the foreign-born population there grow quite significantly. So today, around 1 in 5 of people living in Swindon were born outside of the UK.
How does that compare to national average?
It's around average. I mean, and that's sort of why we chose to go there. There are places, Birmingham, Leicester, Luton, where there's a much, much higher percentage of people who are born outside of the UK. But I would say Swindon is around average.
So talk us through your trip to Swindon then. Yeah, I'm sure you met people who were incredibly pro-migration. I'm sure you met people who were incredibly anti. But the bulk probably fit between those two positions somewhere.
Absolutely. So take, for example, a barber shop we went into.
Yeah.
Went in, spoke to the owner. He has 5 employees, 2 are foreign born. The owner of the barbershop himself was born and bred in Swindon. He says he's definitely noticed that there are a lot more foreigners in the town, but he sees that really as a good thing. He's happy to give them work, and he thinks it's good that the town's multicultural. But then in walks Jamie, a customer. So he's in his 50s, he sits down, he's having his hair cut by a barber who's from Goa in India. And I ask him what he thinks about migration. And very quickly he talks about the fact that he owns a construction business. In the past he was a shop fitter, that foreign workers coming into the country drove prices down. But then he says but he ended up employing 2 foreign workers because they worked much harder than his British employees, he said. But then when I asked him, well, does he think the numbers are too high coming into the country? He said something really interesting. He said there are parts of England you go to now where you feel like an outsider. So he really feels like it's gone too far, despite the fact that he has happily employed migrant workers and been happy with the job that they've done for him. So there's the nuance. It's almost a slight hypocrisy. And we see that in a lot of people's views. Yeah.
That was the word I was going to use there, hypocrisy, because for any discussion like this, I wonder whether it is empirical data that is driving people's views of migration, or if it is instead these rather more ephemeral thoughts about what Britain was, what Britain is, and what Britain will be. And I think there is a tendency for us all to assume that those who are not necessarily anti-migration, but less pro-migration, shall we say, are white. Okay? And that just is not universally true. I mean, even in Swindon, you found someone who had arrived here from Afghanistan, of all places, now saying that perhaps there was too much immigration.
Yeah, so he runs a car wash. He told me he came over as an asylum seeker from Afghanistan, came in on the back of a lorry from France back in 2001, was granted asylum then, and has spent the rest of his life living here in Britain, most of it in Swindon. Now, the people that were working at his car wash, and I was talking to him, he said, oh yeah, they're all pretty much asylum seekers who have work permits. So you'd assume this would be a man who would be in favour of immigration. And as soon as I asked him what he thought about the numbers, he said, oh, it's too high. There are too many people coming in. And
Why?
He said an example of why he feels that is that now when he or his family member goes to the hospital, they're waiting 3-4 hours to see a doctor. And he's noticed that sort of deterioration in the availability of public services in the 20 or so years that he's lived in Britain. And he's blaming that on the number of migrants coming in. Interestingly as well, he, by night, if you like, he's a taxi driver, and was telling me that he gets tasked with moving asylum seeker families between taxpayer-funded hotels. And he thinks to himself, I wonder how much this is costing the government. And he actually said he doesn't think the UK government should be paying to put asylum seekers up in hotels, despite himself being a former asylum seeker.
Let's step away from the qualitative and look at the quantitative for a second. What do we know about the level of foreign workers in the British workforce?
In 2024, so this year, currently, we've got around 6.8 million foreign-born workers in the UK, and that is just over 20% of the workworkforce.
Significant.
So a fifth of the UK workforce foreign-born.
And is that rising or falling?
It's rising. So 10 years ago, it was around 15% of the UK workforce was foreign-born. So that's actually quite a steep increase in the last 10 years.
What do we know about where these migrants are working, just in terms of the sectors, the level of skill that they are needing?
We do have a skills shortage list for which people can get visas. But actually, foreign-born workers, 36% of them are in high-skilled work. And that's actually higher than the percentage of UK-born workers. So 36% foreign-born workers in high-skilled work, 33% of UK-born workers are in high-skilled work.
Which I suppose runs counter to general perceptions. But if you are coming here on a work visa, you're not coming here for unskilled labour, are you?
No. And you know what? You're also coming here to work. And this is quite a stark statistic, the next one. 82% of migrant men are in work. So working-age migrant men, 82% of them work. Now, UK-born working-age men, only 78% work. So not a vast difference, but actually, if you're a man of working age born abroad, you're more likely to be in work than a man of working age born in the UK. It actually serves to back up to opposing views on migration. If you are of the view that migrant workers are needed to boost the UK economy, to keep Britain moving, then you'll look at that data and say, well, look, we need them. If you're of the mind that migrants are coming over, taking the jobs of British workers, you'll look at this data and say, well, look, that's exactly what they're doing. So I think whichever view people have of migration, they could use these stats to say, well, look, this is proof.
I mean, it strikes me that there's an awful lot of focus on small boats, on illegal immigration, as some have begun to call it, rather than the absolutely massive increase in net migration that we've seen. Do you think people understand where these people are flocking from?
No. And as you say, the vast majority of migration is legal migration, people coming to work in the UK. I think what we have to remember in all of this debate, successive governments have allowed the situation to get where it is, where we've got a fifth of the workforce is non-UK born. And remember, while politicians talk tough, it's their policies that allow people to come in. It would be in the gift of a government to stop handing out visas at any point. But they don't. We know that British industry has argued over many years that it needs migrant workers. And that's really, when a party becomes the government, it's all very well making promises during elections, but they hear the views of British voters, who many of which would like to see the numbers cut. But they're also listening to British industry, who's argued, the NHS and other industries, that they desperately need people. And that's why I think the numbers, we're not hearing too many promises on exactly how much the numbers will be cut by.
Becky, many thanks. We'll return in just a moment. Ed Conway has been looking back at the UK's relationship with workers from the rest of the world. Stay there. Welcome back. Now, all too often, discussion around immigration is based rather more on gut feeling than great data. So let's try and inject just a little bit of the latter. Let's bring in our economics and data editor, Ed Conway. Ed, look, we've been saying, without qualification and frankly without any data, that we have been seeing significant, very significant amounts of net migration to this country. Walk us through the figures and explain exactly where these people are coming from.
Small boats, okay, it's definitely bigger than it's been for some time, okay? And the numbers are sizable. Like in the last year, it's give or take, it's about 30,000 people coming across in small boats. So remember that number, 30,000. The total amount of immigration we're talking about for the country as a whole, it's not 30,000, it's about 1.2 million.
What?
1.2 million people in the last year came into the country. And then a certain proportion,
Legally, though?
Yeah, legally. The vast majority of the immigration into this country is legal migration, and it is enormous. Okay, so you've got two narratives going on here. You've got the narrative of people talking about small boats and clearly being very concerned by it and being concerned by illegal migration and seeing all the coverage of that and thinking, gosh, that must be the majority of the migration into our country. But it's not. It's a tiny, teeny fraction of the bigger picture. And the bigger picture is enormous. By the way, when we talk about these things, all net migration means is you take away the people who are leaving from the people who are coming.
Of course,
so you just end up with the kind of total figure by which it's increasing the population. But whether you're looking at immigration, to be honest with you, or net migration, the numbers are just historically high right now. But I looked at the numbers as a percentage of the population, and the last 2 years is greater in terms of the net inward flows to this country than we have ever seen, going all the way back to 1855.
Okay, so since 1855?
Since 1855. Like most of these numbers, when people talk about the data on migration, mostly they're looking back, maybe a decade or so, looking back to 2010 or 2000. No, if you look back to the middle of the Victorian period, we have never seen anything like this. And I think this matters because...
No. I'm just saying that let no one accuse you of not being thorough.
Well, I mean, the data's not... It's kind of useless unless you have something to compare it to. And comparing it to history is as good a thing as any. And, we think culturally in this country, there are big cultural moments. The Windrush generation, you've got the kind of large numbers of people coming in from South Asia to parts of the Midland in the kind of 1950s, 60s. These are things that have shaped our nation as we know it. And yet the scale of migration that we're seeing right now per capita of the population is greater than in any of those previous periods. So it's understandable if people want to think about this and talk about this and debate about it. Like in the last... Okay, so can I give you just a few figures to underline this? Since 2021, okay, so a couple of years, 3 years, 2 years of decent data, the number of people come into this country from India, 670,000. The number of people coming from Nigeria, 310,000. The number coming from China, 274,000 people. We have Pakistan, 166,000. And by the way, when people say, listen, most of the migration, isn't it just distorted by Ukraine and Hong Kong and all of those things? No, Ukraine, you're talking about 100,000 or so.
Sure.
And that's the bit. So people are not talking about the fact that we have had, essentially, getting on for 1 million people coming from Nigeria and India into this country in the last few years.
But presumably a large chunk of
This is all legal.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But presumably a large chunk of that will not be arriving here necessarily on a work visa, but on a student.
A chunk of that is student, but even if you take away students, you're still talking. So India, 670,000. Take away students, and it's still 300,000, just work visas. Okay. And what's changed here is that new rules have come into place after we left the EU. So you look at the chart, and I've been showing these charts on Sky, and you can see them online. You look at the chart of UK net migration, it doesn't change that much. Then the new post-Brexit rules come into play, and suddenly totally unprecedented increases in inward migration.
Take back control. I remember that being bandied around a few times during the referendum. So why didn't we?
Well, you can make the argument that this is us taking control of our migration system and completely changing the nature of it.
Who is making that argument? Because I'd like to speak.
Well, exactly. I know. Well, but theoretically, this is as a consequence of rules that we have made, and that was always the argument: is that we in the EU, we didn't control migration within the EU, okay? But what's happened in practice here, okay, is that we have more than replaced migration from Europe with enormous amounts of migration from elsewhere. So net migration from Europe is basically in negative territory. There are more people leaving this country to go to Europe than there are coming in. That's never happened since we joined the EU, as far as I can tell. And yet that's been completely kind of replaced by people coming from India, from China. So you see why I think this is something we need to think about both in data terms, but also in kind of like a cultural sense, because that was a part of our cultural story that we were becoming more kind of enmeshed with Europe, Polish plumbers, all of that stuff. This is bigger than that. It's bigger than that, and it's happening right now, and it's there in the data.
But is it happening solely as a result of us shutting our borders to European Union workers who wanted to come here on a whim or even as part of a long-term plan? I don't have a laptop in front of me. I don't have the data. But I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that a sizable chunk, if not the biggest chunk, of those work visas were to come here to work in health and social care.
Yeah, that's exactly that. I've got a laptop in front of me, and I can confirm. I can confirm. And this is kind of interesting, okay, because I know you want to talk in a bit about that we're in an election. You've got different parties talking about their plans. The reform plan, I'll answer your question in a sec, but the reform manifesto, or contract as they want to call it, that came out, the main thing that people are talking about when they're talking about reform and Nigel Farage is he wants net zero migration. That's his message that he wants to get across. Okay, so zero. So more people, basically the same number of people leaving the country as are entering.
Which would suggest that we have what we need in this country as of this moment to do everything that we want to do.
Well,
that's nonsense.
You're probably presuming in a more kind of sophisticated way than I think it's just a very clever bit of kind of catchphrase from Nigel Farage. But that's the catchphrase. I was kind of curious about that because I was looking at the Reform Manifesto and I tried to look for the bit where they say we commit to net zero migration. There is no bit. In fact, the bit about migration, they say we want to freeze migration on the cover of it. But then you kind of go a few pages in and they say we want to freeze all but essential migration. And what do they say is essential migration? That is skilled workers, particularly those in health and care. Okay, and that just got me thinking, okay, so how many workers are there in health and care that have come in on visas recently? And the answer is, in the last year, nearly 150,000. Most economic studies of migration show that migrants, for the most part, make a net contribution. And mostly that's because people who have come across, it depends. You need to adjust for how many family members they're bringing. But mostly it's because they're younger people, they go out and work. They're coming to work. That's part of the attraction.
But this isn't a situation that has emerged out of absolutely nowhere, is it? I mean, we have had generation of politicians after generation of politicians who either refused to engage with the debate around migration. I think of the last Labour government, frankly, and the way in which they just shook their hands, ran away holding their noses whenever the issue of migration.
And they could have done it differently. This is the kind of the EU, new accession countries, Eastern Europe, Poland. They could have done it very differently. Other countries had a kind of time limit on that, and it's because I think people are scared about debating this issue because they're worried, frankly, that if they sound sceptical about migration and want to put limits on that, then they're going to be accused of being a racist. That's their inner fear. And it means perhaps as a result that we're not having a kind of grown-up conversation based on the data, based on what's actually happening here, which says, look, there are definite positives. There are definite economic reasons why we need migration in this country. Look what happened post-COVID. We don't have enough people in the workforce right now. We've got a shortage of workers. But it's such a kind of fractious argument that unfortunately by politicians is often prosecuted in a intentionally fractious way. And it gets to the heart of people, which is people feel unsettled about the country they're living in at the moment. And that's understandable because that's the case here. It's the case in America and many other places.
It is understandable, but I also don't think it is a coincidence that the person who's talking most openly, most loudly about immigration at this election is the person who's potentially making some very, very significant gains, and that is Nigel Farage.
Yeah, except, as we say, the actual policies, if you look at the policies that Reform is suggesting, they are really not that different to what the Conservatives have already basically implemented. And I mean, Labour and what they're doing, and they're saying as little as they can about this. They want to reform the points-based system. They want to put a little bit more focus on it. The Tories want to introduce new caps. I mean, like the caps have ever made any difference in the past. So it's frustrating. But then you could have exactly the same conversation about Brexit. No one really actually wants to talk about the pros and cons of Brexit right now because everyone's had enough of talking about it. And so let's just move on and not think about it. To be honest with you, in this case, here we have an election, and maybe we should kind of at least discuss some of this stuff, but people thought it was done in the last election, 2019. Get Brexit done. Let's not talk about it. And my suspicion is we'll just slowly trundle towards a kind of Swiss-style arrangement, which is basically where you have just a jumble of different bilateral treaties that mean while you're not officially part of the single market and the customs union, basically you are in all but name. Hopefully, as far as the politicians are concerned, they hope they've diffused it and made it seem so boring they don't ever have to discuss it again.
Ed, thank you. To be clear, both Labour and Conservative governments have contributed to the absence of an informed discussion around migration. Both had the opportunity to engage substantively with the public whilst literally running the country. In their absence, Nigel Farage has stepped once more onto the breach. So, what of Ed Conway's suggestion that it's time for an adult conversation about migration during a general election campaign? Frankly, you've got more chance of the small boats stopping by themselves. That's your lot for this edition of The Daily. We'll see you again tomorrow.